With the cost of living being so high and the average person's wage not enough, it isn't surprising that more people are turning to a life of crime out of desperation. Unfortunately, the blame is placed squarely on individuals doing what they can to make ends meet, and not the system that's put them in a position where they have to make those kinds of choices. The consequences can be devastating. Leah, Jenny, and Paige had grown up together. They had lived on the same street dedicated to public housing for low-income families. Being raised in poverty meant that they had become very resourceful, excellent at budgeting, stretching meals, and making the most of what they had. They had grown accustomed to this lifestyle and had always managed to get by, up until the year 2020 when COVID hit. Inflation started to skyrocket, prices went up, landlords and property managers started charging ridiculous amounts of rent out of greed, with no consideration to how it affects the economy and people who are not eligible for home loans. Their minimum wage jobs were no longer enough to cover the cost of living. Ideally, anyone who works full-time should be able to afford everything they need and a bit extra, though not many of us can. Jenny had 2 children to support. Her husband had died from a respiratory infection not long after COVID had been announced. Her grief made it difficult not to let ideas of conspiracy theories such as bioweapons and population control cloud her thoughts. She worked at the supermarket while the kids were at school and ironed other people's laundry on the weekends for a bit of extra cash. She was constantly exhausted, but still did her best to maintain a positive attitude and give her kids everything they deserved. When Jenny received a notice regarding a significant increase in the rent, it broke her. She couldn't afford it, but she couldn't afford to live anywhere else either. All the other rental properties costed even more than what the landlord was now asking, and it would have been a 10-year wait for public housing. Jenny was worried that she'd become homeless and lose her kids. Jenny confided in Paige and Leah the following day when they came to visit. Paige told Jenny she would move in with her to cover the rent increase. "Are you sure that's what you want?" Jenny cried. "Of course I'm sure. I hate living in a share house with a bunch of people I don't even like. I'd much rather live with you and the kids," Paige replied. She put her arm around Jenny's shoulders to try and comfort her. Leah felt sick with anxiety and rage. She knew that things were only going to get worse for the working class. "Girls, this might work for now, but what are we going to do when all 3 of us can't afford the rent for one property? We need to do something," she said a little louder than intended. "There's not a whole lot we can do, Leah. This is just the way things are," Paige replied. "I know we can't overthrow capitalism, but we need to make sure we'll be okay in this emerging dystopian nightmare. We need a side hustle," insisted Leah. "Well, I'm not built for OnlyFans," Paige laughed. "Yeah, and I've had 2 kids. Nobody wants to see that," Jenny chimed in. No, not OnlyFans. Crime," Jenny exclaimed, smacking her hands on the table. "You want us to start doing crimes?" "Sorry, but no thanks. I'd rather not go to jail," Jenny replied. Paige sat quietly considering this proposition. "What crimes can we make money from and get away with?" she wondered. "Let me come up with a plan, then we'll revisit this conversation," Leah insisted as she stood up, getting ready to leave. "Paige, let me know if you want help bringing your stuff over," she said on her way out. Leah was let go from her job in electronic sales not long after she had started planning her life of crime. Paige worked at the same company, but she was more conventionally attractive and a lot pushier with customers, therefore closed more deals than Leah. Management decided to get rid of anyone who wasn't meeting sales targets, and although Leah had a good work ethic and always did her best, she just wasn't getting those numbers at the end of the day. Leah felt no resentment towards Paige, but losing her job did give her incentive to move forward with her plan. Fortunately, Leah found another job fairly quickly. She was hired by a wealthy older couple as a support person for their autistic son with co-occurring intellectual disability. After being interviewed by the parents, Leah expected that Freddie couldn't be much older than 5. The way they described him misled her to think he was much younger than he really was. Freddie was 22 and far more capable than his parents seemed to think. Leah was fine with this though. It was an easy job and decent pay. She could see Freddie's frustration with his parents though. He could have been living an independent life of his own with the right support. If only Trudy and Scott hadn't insisted on treating him like a child. When Leah was over, she allowed Freddie to cook his own meals, use social media, and even let him have a go at driving her car. It pissed her off how much Trudy and Scott had grossly underestimated his potential, probably due to the fact that they hardly ever spent any time with him. One night, when Leah was at work, Freddie casually mentioned that his uncle owned a very expensive speedboat and kept the keys hidden under the driver's seat. "Well, I suppose there would be cameras around if anyone tried to take it," Leah replied. "There are cameras, but none of them actually work. It's just to trick people," Freddie responded. This was a light bulb moment for Leah. Her plan started to unfold. The next time she met up with Jenny and Paige, Leah told them all about the rich uncle's boat. She wanted to steal it and sell it. "No, Leah, we're not going to do that. We'll get caught. Besides, it's only one boat. We'd go through the money pretty quickly just keeping up with our rent and bills. It's not worth it," Jenny stated firmly. "It starts with the boat, but then we find more stuff to sell. We'll make a business out of it," exclaimed Leah. "I'm not agreeing to anything yet, but let's brainstorm and see where it takes us," said Paige. So the three of them spent all afternoon planning theft and illegal sale of a speedboat. Eventually, they came to an agreement that was low risk and almost guaranteed to work. On the night of their robbery, things took an unexpected turn. The rich uncle happened to show up at 2:30 a.m., asking just what in the hell they thought they were doing. They weren't wearing any masks, as they didn't think they would need to. Leah panicked and beat the man over the head with an old wine bottle that happened to be lying on the wharf. The bottle was still half full. It shattered against his skull and dropped him instantly. The remaining liquid ran down the back of his polo, leaving a foul, fermenting smell in the air. At first, they were all too stunned to react, until Paige broke the silence by suggesting that since he'd seen their faces before being violently assaulted, the best course of action would be to leave immediately. "We can't just leave him here. He needs to go to the hospital," snapped Jenny. "We'll call an ambulance from a payphone," insisted Leah as she grabbed Jenny's arm, trying to pull her away. "At least let me check that he's still alive," Jenny replied, jerking her arm away. She knelt beside the body on the wharf and tried to listen for breathing. She couldn't hear anything. She felt for a pulse, but there was nothing there. Then, out of desperation, she started shaking him, screaming at him to wake up. "Shh!" hissed Leah. "Don't go drawing attention to us." Jenny started dry reaching. "Get her out of here before she throws up. I'll deal with this," Paige said, taking control of the situation. Leah hurried back to the car with her arm around Jenny's waist, pulling her along, and they waited for Paige to return. Paige was only a small woman, but very strong and athletic. She dragged the man's body over to the boat and stuffed him into the floor compartment. Leah's housemates were conveniently away that night, so they went back to her place. Paige and Leah seemed calm on the surface, but Jenny was a nervous wreck. Leah slipped one of her housemates' Valiums into her coffee to calm her down. She held it together well, but on the inside she was struggling with the fact that she would have to face Freddie's family again and continue working for them like nothing had happened. They went on with their lives as usual, occasionally experiencing an intense wave of panic whenever a police officer happened to be nearby. They all monitored the news headlines closely, but nothing ever come up about the body being found. Freddie's family never said anything about the uncle. Leah almost started to wonder if they'd hallucinated the whole thing. Paige became paranoid that everyone knew, and the police were just waiting for the right moment to confront them. Jenny didn't think about what happened. She pushed it down to the back of her mind and refused to let it creep into her thoughts. If Paige or Leah tried to bring it up, she would continue on with a completely different conversation, as though she hadn't heard them. One night, Leah was playing Monopoly with Freddie when he told her his uncle was coming back from Thailand the following week. "We'll get to go out on the boat again," he told her excitedly. Leah's stomach sunk. For a moment, she thought she might faint. "Sorry, what was that?" she asked in disbelief. "He's been overseas for a while traveling. He's coming home at the end of the week," Freddie repeated. Leah tried not to let it show that her hands were shaking as they finished the game of Monopoly. That night she called an emergency meeting with Jenny and Paige. Leah went over to the house Jenny and Paige shared when the kids were in bed, and for the first time in 3 months, they had to talk about the murder. Though Leah would argue it was manslaughter as it hadn't been premeditated. She filled the other two in on what Freddie had told her. "Well, who was that guy then?" Jenny snapped, suddenly very pale and short of breath. "I don't know. It might have been someone keeping an eye on the boats, or maybe a friend of his. I guess we'll find out soon enough," Leah replied. "Well, what do we do now? Do we go back and move the body?" Jenny continued. "Absolutely not," Paige answered quickly. "Never return to the scene of the crime." They discussed what Leah might say if she ended up being questioned by the police, and once again got on with their lives as normal, though this time it was much harder to ignore the sense of impending doom as the weekend approached. Saturday came around and Leah received a call from Freddie's dad. He kept it vague, but informed her there had been an incident on the boat and Freddie was quite distressed. He asked that she come over immediately since Freddie had taken such a liking to her. She took a moment to prepare herself, then made her way over to the family home. Freddie's parents were waiting on the porch. It was evident that Trudy had been crying. The mascara left streaking marks down her face. Scott led Leah up to Freddie's room. As they passed the living room, Leah saw Freddie's uncle sitting on the couch. There were 2 police officers sitting opposite him. They got to the door of Freddie's bedroom and Scott explained that he had locked himself in there and was refusing to come out. "I'll be downstairs with Trudy if you need anything," Scott said, placing a cold hand on her shoulder. He went back down and Leah gently knocked at the door. "Freddie, it's Leah. Can I come in?" she asked. "No, parents," Freddie shouted back. No, your parents are downstairs," she replied, and slowly opened the door. Freddie was sitting at his computer desk, frowning at the screen. He had his headphones on, but could obviously still hear her. "Do you want to talk about what happened?" asked Leah, pulling up a chair beside him. "I threw up because it smelled so bad. Now my mum thinks I'm traumatized," he replied, still frowning at the screen. "It must have been really terrifying," Leah said gently. "It wasn't terrifying, it was just gross. I'm not a baby," Freddie insisted. "You know that guy who sleeps at the train station? Well, imagine if he shat his pants and then sat out in the sun for a good few hours. That was the smell," Freddie continued. Leah couldn't help but chuckle. "Did you see it?" she asked. "No, but it must have been something big to smell that bad. Maybe a dog or a pile of dead cats," Freddie responded. Leah realized he had no idea it was a human body they'd found on the boat. "Parents just worry sometimes, but they mean well," said Leah. "Mum wouldn't stop crying and hugging me. It was so embarrassing," Freddie told her, turning the music up on his headset to let her know he was done talking. She gave him a gentle pat on the back and went back downstairs. "Freddie said there was a dead animal in the boat." Leah said as she approached the parents. The police were gone now, and his uncle was outside talking on the phone. Oh, thank goodness. We won't tell him otherwise, Trudy replied, squeezing her husband's arm. It wasn't an animal, it was a human, Scott said gravely. Leah did her best to appear shocked, as though she were only just finding out about this. We have no idea who it was or why he was on Chad's boat, he continued, glancing outside to his brother as he spoke. Eventually the story made the news, and the man's identity was released to the public, along with a desperate plea from his wife asking anyone with information to come forward. Patrick was a 45-year-old father of 3 whose business had gone under during the COVID lockdowns. He had since been finding work as a handyman doing odd jobs. After watching the interview with Patrick's wife, his connection to Chad became clear. His wife had talked about how Patrick had been involved in some kind of money laundering scheme with a very corrupt businessman and was never paid what he had been promised. Each time Patrick had confronted this man whose identity was not known, he would gaslight him and pretend not to know Patrick or anything about what he was saying. The last time Patrick had tried to collect his share of the money, this businessman had called the police and painted him as a mentally deranged drunk who had been harassing him for money. The cops believed him and took Patrick home, then issued a restraining order in front of his wife and kids. Patrick had never disclosed any identifying information about the people he'd been working with, but his wife was certain they had something to do with his demise. Leah came to the conclusion that Patrick had the same intention to steal and sell Chad's boat. She was consumed with guilt and turned herself in to give Patrick's family the closure they deserved. She told the police she'd acted alone to spare her friends from serving time. She was sentenced to 20 years, no parole. Before going to jail, Leah sent a letter to Patrick's family, and his wife obviously made the connection between Chad and the money laundering scheme because she was very active with the press and social media, demanding Chad be investigated. Eventually he was, and both he and Scott were found guilty of fraud, tax evasion, and drug trafficking. Jenny and Paige continued to struggle with the cost of living and devised another criminal plan. They started catfishing rich older people who were foolish and narcissistic enough to believe someone much younger and much more attractive was in love with them. It was a solid income, but the sad thing was, most of the people they were scamming were married and were fully prepared to discard their lifelong partners for the idea of someone young and attractive. People will do unethical things when they're forced into a corner, but what's most disturbing are the people who choose to be cruel for no reason other than greed and selfishness, and there are far too many of them in the world.